And thank you, Chris, for speaking tonight. So Chris Davis is a plant ecologist with the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. He was born and raised in Akron, Ohio, before moving to California to study biology at, Occidental College in Los Angeles, followed by a graduate program at San Diego State University. Chris has worked as a biologist with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service. He currently works as the plant ecologist at Cuyahoga Valley National Park, where his main responsibilities include managing invasive plants, reforesting disturbed sites, and restoring streams and rivers.
Okay.
All right, I'll stop sharing and you should be able to.
And I will try, and then you know how it goes, so I'll probably be off screen. So if there's a mistake or something, let me know. Let's see how this goes.
Oh, there it is.
Okay, does it seem to be working?
Yes.
All right.
There it is.
So I'm just going to jump into it. Sherry had said to try and keep this, I think, to half an hour-ish. So that's kind of my goal. You know, hopefully that works out. So first, I didn't know, who was going to be here or who knows about the park or whatever. So this first slide is just a quick introduction. Hopefully you can see on your screen in the center of the kind of all those squiggly blue lines is a little green blob. That is Cuyahoga Valley National Park, located pretty much centrally between Akron and Cleveland. The park boundary covers about 33,000 acres. We don't own all that property. A lot of it actually is still private. A lot of it's owned by Cleveland Metro Parks, Summit Metro Parks, and some other local organizations. But we are definitely the dominant landowner, particularly along the Cuyahoga River. And some of our major habitats here, by far the dominant habitat at the park is forest, with oak, hickory, and then beech maple forest being the predominant, habitat types here. We also have tons of wetlands. Obviously, the Cuyahoga River goes through the middle of the park. So we have a lot of diversity, but mostly forest. So the Cuyahoga River, probably everybody on this call has some idea about the background, kind of a disaster. The Cuyahoga River burned many, many times, not just in 1969. That's the most famous event, but it burned, almost a dozen times before that over many years. People think this was kind of a lot of people, at least some anomaly, but this was going on all over the country. Virtually all the major rivers and all the major cities were devastatingly polluted and catching on fire. And it wasn't just the rivers, it was the coastline too. The same time that the Cuyahoga River was burning in 1969, well, almost the same time. Also, it's the bay out in Santa Barbara, California. I don't know if anybody's been to Santa Barbara. Super beautiful, very wealthy city. But back in the day, that also super polluted. That bay was burning. So this was kind of a common occurrence throughout the country. And literally at the time, some parts of the Cuyahoga River, there was no life. There was no oxygen. It was so polluted, even the most basic of life forms could not survive there except for maybe some bacteria. So that was then. This is now, 50 years later or so from the time of the last fire on the river. You can see on the pictures on the left, water quality way, 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 way much improved. Water clarity very improved. We have some big fish back in the river. I'm going to talk about the fish and the water and this weird Davy Jones locker type thing on the bottom of the screen a little later. So I'm just going to skip over. But things are drastically different now than they were even as recently as the 1970s. So the current status, this is a picture basically of a representative photo of the Cuyahoga River in the park. So again, way, way, way improved over the historic conditions, over the last couple hundred years, but also not great. You can see in this picture that vertical eroding bank. There are trees falling in, young trees. There aren't a lot of trees along the bank in most of the park. Historically, way back, there would have been huge giant trees growing on those banks. There would have been a little, floodplain shelf. It wouldn't have been this eroding cut bank. I've heard from even people who are very educated about rivers and water quality, they're kind of oh, well, rivers just do their thing. And, they do to an extent, but there's also like just some physical laws that they have to follow. And so rivers around the whole world, again, they don't look the same. And at any given time, they're always changing. But there are some general, again, they're almost laws about how the rivers meander and shape and how long they should be based on slopes and all that kind of stuff. So again, they're not magical and they still are affected by what humans are doing. Again, current status, we did a bank survey a few years ago, and we found that about a third of the bank, based on this, 36% of the bank, is dominated by an invasive plant called Japanese knotweed. That is the photo in the bottom right-hand corner with that little orange kayaker going in front of it. Japanese knotweed, super invasive. It's hard for anything native to grow up under that like dense canopy. We also have almost a third of the park is dominated by these, almost vertical eroding cut banks. Sometimes they're short, sometimes they're a few feet, like in that last picture. Sometimes they're monsters. Sometimes they're 10, 20 feet tall, just a cut bank eroding into the river. And the top right-hand photo shows like a really, and this is not uncommon at the park, where like there's some big kind of old trees that are growing right down to the river's edge. They're holding the bank in place. Right next to them is an unvegetated section of the bank. And you can see the river just cutting back into that. So we have this like kind of mosaic along the whole length of the 26 miles in the park boundaries, where it goes from occasionally a pretty nice little like native forested bank to just this crazy invasive, and also then this crazy cut bank situation. So what's contributed to some of these problems we continue to have? One of the first, maybe the biggest, development. These series of photos in these two slides, or images in these slides, just show how development has changed over time. You can see in the left-hand image how around the park, so this is basically focusing on the park, it's went from basically a mosaic of undeveloped forest and farmland back in the 50s to almost completely developed today. The more development there is, the more impervious surface there is. Rain falls, it hits the asphalt or whatever the impervious thing is, and it just runs off. There's no absorption, there's no like groundwater, rescue of this kind of stormwater. Just goes into the creeks, into the pipes, and then into the Cuyahoga River. Interestingly, I think on the right-hand one, this is showing how land use changed between 1948 and 2005 in Cuyahoga County. The big red blob at the top is basically Cleveland. But the interesting thing is the population between those two times in the county hardly changed. It was in both years about 1.4 million. It's just how and where people are living. So we've moved out of these dense urban areas into this sprawling, suburban development. And so you can see again, going from the top in 1948 in Cuyahoga County, surrounded by really farmland. Today, it's almost all developed. So again, what does that do? The more rain we get, the more it just runs off immediately into our rivers and creeks. Not good for stormwater retainment. Oh, how did that happen? Hold on. Something crazy is happening here. Okay. I'm almost there. I hit the wrong button. So another factor that's causing some issues today is increased precipitation. So we looked at, with the Army Corps of Engineers, at some of the rain gauges in Northeast Ohio, and you can see some of them go back, 80 years down at Cleveland Hopkins Airport. That's been there a long time. Chardon. So we have about 80 years worth of data. And in general, you can see the trend over that 60 to 80 years, slightly increasing year to year. So overall, we increase our precipitation by about an inch every 10 years. And so over 6 or 8 years, compared to back in the 1940s and 50s, we're getting 6 to 8 more inches of rain per year in this area. It's falling on more impervious surface. So that's a bad combination. It's kind of a double whammy. More rain, more asphalt, more runoff directly into rivers and creeks. So, those rivers and creeks, they're not designed to hold and carry all that much water in that short of a time. So this is causing some of that bank erosion you saw in some of those photos. Another issue, particularly with the Cuyahoga River, some people think of it as still pretty curvy and, meanders a lot. And there's this perception that that's kind of natural. And to some extent it is in some areas. But this is just one example of several I could show of where in 1966, in the late 60s, they rebuilt a bridge that crosses the Cuyahoga River on the border of Brecksville, the city of Brecksville, and Sagamore Township, and Sagamore Hills. And when they did that, they cut off about 1,800 feet of river for this one project. And they also straightened the river under the bridge. So this is just one example of several where we've cut off thousands of feet of river length. And what does that do? When you have the same start and end elevations, but you make the distance between those 2 points shorter, it makes the slope steeper. So the water is running faster. So again, we have more rain, it's hitting more impervious surface, and it's traveling a shorter distance between 2 points, which means more and more erosion. And then hopefully, I think this is one of the final kind of contributing factors that I'm going to talk about today, is something called aggradation. We hear a lot about degradation, how things are getting, kind of degraded, which means they're getting lower and lower in quality. Well, this is aggradation. Well, actually, the floodplain along the Cuyahoga River has grown. It's risen over sometimes a very short periods of times, even decades, by feet, by several feet to 6 to 10 feet. And these photos on here, the top left one is showing a shovel where we did a creek restoration. You can see that little tree in the back. Just in the past couple of decades, and since I've been at this park, that floodplain has grown several feet around that tree. In the top right-hand corner, you can see a tree that's falling on its side. There's a shovel on top of that tree. Shovels are, I don't know, it's maybe 5 feet, something like that. But you can see where that tree started to grow 60 years ago or so. And by the time it fell, when we were doing this creek restoration project, the floodplain had risen about 6 feet around that tree. So the river is not getting incised, it's not cutting into the floodplain. Actually, the floodplain is growing up along the river. And the bottom, this one's maybe hard to see on your screens, the bottom left picture shows a hole. We were doing some archaeology right adjacent to a road in the floodplain, Stanford Road, and you can see some little plastic about 2 feet down in that hole, where this is just modern plastic. I don't remember if that was a fork or what it was, but that was buried there. It's now buried feet under what used to be the floodplain, only, again, a few decades ago. So there's still a lot of issues going on with the river. Definitely way, 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 way better than it was back in the 60s and 70s. Still issues. There's this certain phenomenon that's called the shifting baseline syndrome. And it was first kind of started to talk about in the scientific community back in the 70s, when some scientists asked some kids in Houston just what they thought about air quality. It was kind of a sociological study. And all the kids thought that air quality there, not all, but a lot of the kids, it was just fine. It's what they were used to. But kind of empirically, scientifically, air quality in Houston at that time was horrendous. But that's what the kids knew. So they thought it was okay. Again, as the baseline shifted, the kids didn't know what it used to be back, like in the old days. They just know what they grew up with. And even people who really think they understand the environment in some cases don't really realize that they're being tricked by this shifting baseline syndrome. And so on the screen are 2 photos taken, you can see maybe hopefully by basically the same operation in Florida. Gulf Stream, the one on the left in 1957, that was the original Gulf Stream when this yachting, fishing operation was started. The one on the right is Gulf Stream 3. So that's 2 generations later. But you can see back in the 50s, people were catching these huge fish in this exact same area. Today, these guys on the right, they're still catching, for me, big fish, and they're catching a lot of them, but there's no comparison. So people today are like, hey, fishing is great in that area. We catch a lot of fish. But when you actually look at what people were catching, a generation or 2 ago, the ones they were catching then would be eating. These are bait fish that we're catching today. But we don't really realize it because this is what we grew up with. And so an example of this, even today, amongst some of our really people who really understand the environment well, is in the top right-hand or left-hand photo, excuse me, and the bottom elongated photo, those are photos of an area that were categorized by Ohio EPA as Category 3, or highest quality wetlands in Ohio, get this designation. And these are areas dominated by non-native invasive plants. You can see that creek is pretty destroyed. There are a few trees, but not a lot. So even people who really know about wetlands are thinking these very degraded systems are top wetlands in the state. The top right-hand photo is a photo of where there used to be a dam. We removed that dam, and now it's a free-flowing river. Immediately, the water quality improved. So even though you can see a railroad track on the far side, there's riprap all along that bank. There's still a concrete abutment. We consider this exceptional warm water habitat today because we have good fish in there and the water quality is pretty good. So what are some of the things we're doing at Cuyahoga Valley? So we're doing our best to try and restore the river. Trying to, when I say restoration, I don't mean to put it back to a perfect condition from the past that we think was, optimal. I'm just talking about really making things better, trying to improve water quality, trying to improve habitat and so on in the river. And on one of these projects we started 6 or 8 years ago, we're working with the Army Corps of Engineers. We asked them for some suggestions. They gave us a bunch of options, and here's 3 of them. One of them was to make the river a little bit longer in one place. That's the area on the left-hand image on the screen. The central one, there's a little blue squiggly line. That's where they're like, hey, why don't we connect the river to the floodplain better? The floodplain's risen. Let's get the river back up onto the floodplain. The one on the right-hand side, that's where they're like, man, there's so much Japanese knotweed out there. Let's just control invasive plants. So there was a big range of alternatives. We ended up choosing one that was basically to make the river longer. We've cut off so much of the river, it's still causing problems. So let's just add some of that length back. And so that's the image in the background that shows the little green squiggles that we were hoping to add to the river in this certain section shown here, which is basically the center of the park. And then we picked another alternative to reintroduce freshwater mussels. I'm going to talk about both of these a little bit more in a minute. So the purpose of the project to lengthen the river is to reduce erosion. Again, there's more water in the river. It's shorter. It's running faster. That causes erosion. So we wanted to reduce erosion and just basically increase the stability of the river. All rivers move. They're always changing. But again, there's certain, physical constraints that they operate under. And then the final thing, we wanted to just basically improve habitat and habitat diversity along the river at the park. So of those 6 options we originally had, for various reasons, we ended up eliminating 5. We ended up with one alternative to restore a meander, basically at that same area where I showed you a picture earlier, where the river had been cut off back in the late 60s when we rerouted this road and rebuilt a bridge in Brecksville. So the proposal is to restore about 1,250 feet of that meander that used to be there. That's not restoring all the length that was lost at this area, but with the constraints we have today, that's what we could do at this site. So the little blue squiggly, kind of worm-like line, the light blue line, that's where we're going to be recreating a meander there that will lengthen the river. It will decrease erosion and hopefully kind of stabilize some of the problems at that site. So what do we expect to happen there? We're going to spend a lot of time controlling invasives, Japanese knotweed, reed canary grass, so on. We're going to cut back some of the banks, and then we're going to plant a lot of trees after we dig out that new channel. And the kind of inset photo there with my hand on it is a sycamore that we planted about 13 years ago. So some trees grow really fast. We're hoping in 10 or 15 years, this new restored section of the river will be somewhat stable. We'll have large trees growing on the banks, which will definitely improve habitat in that area and slow down erosion. As part of this project too, we're going to be restoring some creeks at a golf course we obtained in 2021 south of Peninsula. And after we got the golf course, we did some studies and we found that about 10,000 linear feet, almost 2 miles of historic creeks had either been buried in pipes or channelized into like super deep ditches. And so we have a lot of opportunity at this golf course to really, really improve conditions. As part of this river project, we will be working to restore at least 3,000 to 5,000 feet of that creek at this site at the golf course. And this is just kind of a diagram of that section we're going to be working on. We're going to be pulling this, again, several thousand feet of creek that currently is buried in a pipe about 6 feet underground. We're going to be bringing it back to the surface. And again, we're going to be reforesting that whole kind of floodplain bench along the creek. Hopefully in a few years, we'll have some of these big trees along the way. And so what we're hoping to get, this is a little bit upstream of where the creek is buried, just before it goes into a pipe, basically looks like these photos. It's a really, really super pretty little sedge meadow with some trees just starting to take hold there. So this is kind of what we're hoping in a few years we'll have downstream of this section. We'll just continue from the upstream area you see in these photos through the restored daylighted section of creek out to the Cuyahoga River. So the other alternative we selected that we're working on with the Army Corps and a lot of other partners is trying to restore freshwater mussels to the Cuyahoga River. We have some archaeological studies from way back that documented that before, white settlers came into this area, the Cuyahoga River was full, like just full of thousands and thousands of dozens of species of freshwater mussels. Today, we have virtually none. Back by the time of the 60s, when the river last caught on fire, there were no mussels in this whole section of the river. So we're looking to see if we can restore mussels. The first step of this project was in 2021. We really just put out some small cages. We anchored them in the river and we put adult mussels in there just to see, will they survive? And sure enough, most of them did. We lost a few of the cages. We lost a few of the mussels, but in general, the adult mussels did pretty well. So it wasn't, so basically we documented and confirmed that the water quality in the river today is good enough to support adult mussels. The next step was to say, okay, adults, they may be bigger, they may be tougher. What about the small little baby juvenile mussels, that are just going to be popping out if we get these, populations going in the river? So in 2022, we looked at juvenile survival. We built these weird concrete kind of beach ball size structures, and we put these small little, juvenile mussels in there to see how they did. And we also found that in general, the juveniles did really well. And they also grew pretty well. So all of this was very promising, saying, okay, the conditions seem good for us to put mussels back in the river. So in 2023, we actually did. We got some adults. We did a study to see where do we think the best place to put them back in would be. And we went to those sites and we tagged some of these adults. We put little some of the tags were just numbers, but there were also little like transponders that would tell us where the mussels were when we went out there with the little, it looks like a metal detector. So we tracked how these mussels did, where they moved. And you can see in the bottom right-hand picture, hopefully, these weird squiggly lines, that was showing where some of these mussels really moved around. So that was 2023. Survival was pretty good. By this year, we really had a hard time finding any of these mussels. The tags fell off. Some of the mussels we found, some of them we definitely found dead. But a lot of them tags are just missing. So we have found a few live ones out there. We know some of them are doing okay. And going into the future, we're going to be trying to put more in, more variety, more diversity, more adults. And so we're working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Army Corps of Engineers. We have funding to do to build one of these propagation trailers. We will be raising our own mussels at the park here, and then we'll be placing them directly into the river. So that's going to be coming in the next year or so. Hopefully, we have the funding right now. And again, we're working with one of the Fish and Wildlife Services fish hatcheries to provide us small ones that we're going to raise up and put back into the river. So the Brecksville Canal Diversion Dam. That is a dam that you can see in the top right hand or left hand photo, excuse me. We call it sometimes Route 82 Dam because that is Route 82 on that bridge over the river. We removed that dam about 4 or 5 years ago. Took a little while to get it done, but now we have a free flowing river for the first time within park boundaries. No dams within the park or upstream of the park. The nearest dam at this point is the Gorge Dam, Summit Metro Parks, basically in Cuyahoga Falls area. So we've restored a pretty big stretch of free-flowing river within park boundaries. And again, as soon as we took out that dam, immediately the water quality upstream, even though this was a kind of a short dam, it was only like typically like blocking up 2 to 4 feet of water. Dam was a little taller, but it was affecting hydrology over a mile upstream. So as soon as we took it out, more than a mile of upstream, almost a mile and a half of water quality improved drastically. And we started seeing some cool stuff come in. And so we have been working since then with the U.S. Geological Survey, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, and several other agencies and organizations to sample fish to see what has happened since we've removed the dam. So these are just some examples of us electroshocking fish in the river at the park. And, it doesn't kill the fish. It stuns them. They float to the surface. We can collect them. We measure them. We see what's there. The photo on the right is showing somebody inserting a small tag into a fish, and then we can track them. We now have a system throughout the whole Great Lakes, including many of the rivers, where we have receivers. So when fish with these tags swim by those receivers, we can track where specific individual fish are and where they're going and where they're coming back to. So since we took out the dam, we've seen some fish that probably have not been in the Cuyahoga River in this part of the park upstream of that dam in maybe 200 years. So the top left-hand fish, bigmouth buffalo, that's a super cool, pretty large fish, native fish. Silver red horse, again, another one we're seeing upstream where the dam is. The bottom right-hand photo, that is a small walleye that somebody caught in Peninsula at our Block 29 area, right by the winking lizard. There probably haven't been walleye upstream of that dam, again, perhaps in as long as 200 years or so. So we're seeing cool fish come back into that river pretty much immediately within years of the dam being removed. Bottom left-hand photo, some of you may have heard of round goby. That is actually a non-native invasive fish, really, really, really common now in Lake Erie. So we're also seeing that coming up into the river too. So mostly good, some bad, but again, removing the dam, unquestionably good effects on fish diversity, habitat diversity, and water quality. And so that's kind of a summary of some of the projects we're working on, some of the history, where we were, where we are now, some of the stuff we have planned in the future. That river restoration project to add in that new meander up near that bridge that was moved in Brecksville. We're hoping to start that next spring. So if things go well, so far so good. We're trying to wrap up all the background permitting stuff we need to do this fall. It's really starting to fall into line. So hopefully we'll be doing that project next spring. We'll continue with reintroducing mussels, and hopefully some of the fish will just continue to improve in the area too. So that's the end of my presentation. If anybody has any questions, I'm going to try to stop sharing now, see how this goes. Hopefully I'm now off the sharing screen. Is that for you,
Yep.
Janice? Okay, cool. So if anybody has any questions or comments or anything, I'm happy to try and address them or just listen to what you have to say.
Chris, I have a question. How many varieties of mussels would there be or do you anticipate reintroducing?
So we, not we, the park, but archaeologists, again, through like historic studies, looking at some of the old, so they're kind of more common out west. They call them shell middens, or on the coast. I shouldn't say out west, but on the coast where Native Americans ate a ton of shellfish and would make huge piles of the shells. And so we do have some of those also inland though, too, in the interior of the country. And there was one of those documented in what is now the park. And they had found over, I think it was over 20 different species of mussels back in the day, like, 1,000 years ago, living in the Cuyahoga River. So our initial goal is really just to get any back in there. We're starting to see some indications. Even this year, we might have found one or two like native live mussels in the river on the park stretch. So our goal is to start with some of the most like toughest ones that are kind of more resilient to, turbidity and pollution and stuff, and then go from there. With the goal being made with us to maybe try and get to maybe 8 species in the next few years, and then just who knows after that, Sherry. But the first goal to get a couple, 2 or 3 or 4 species in there, then ramp up a little bit when we get the production trailer going, propagation trailer. And then hopefully, years from now, you and I might not be around here seeing what's in the river. I don't know, but hopefully we'll have a program going that's sustainable with a lot more.
And what kind of trees are you planting along the banks? I know you said sycamore. What other trees do you
So
find?
some of the ones that we have been planting most commonly, like kind of in our lowland floodplainy areas at the park, we've done about 200 acres of reforestation so far. We have a few hundred more, 400 acres, like kind of lined up over the next few years. And so the lower ones that we plan along more in the floodplain areas, sycamore, box elder, silver maple, cottonwoods, swamp white oaks. Those are some of the most common ones. Then we've planted walnuts. They do okay in some of those wetter areas, and, a variety of other species. But so the main big ones are swamp white oak, sycamore, box elder, cottonwood, silver maple.
Okay.
Anything
Do
else?
you,
Yeah, Chris,
you
I have a
have-
question. Go ahead.
go ahead, Diane.
Okay. So I was just curious, maybe you said it and I might have missed it, but why'd you pick mussels as the sort of key plant or I mean,
The key indicator, like the creature.
Sea urchin?
Yeah. Yeah. So the reason we picked mussels, okay, so there's a couple of reasons. First of all, we have this documented studies that there used to be tons of mussels in the river, then to virtually none. So it's just something that should be there. We destroyed those communities. It's kind of, again, just kind of on us, I think, to help bring them back. Okay, so that's one reason. But the other reason, particularly for mussels, is they're filter feeders. So some people think, oh, they can clean the water, and they can't. They can't clean the stuff that was burning back in the 1950s and 60s. That's too much. I mean, again, they're not supernatural. They will die. There's too much pollution. But if the water quality is good, but in some areas a little bit questionable, mussels will help. Like a single mussel can filter 25 to maybe in some states 40 or 50 gallons of water a day. So they're also like good cleaners of the river as long as they can survive in the river. And so we're documented they can survive there today. So again, it's just like they would just help us make things better over time if we can get more in the river. At some point they can do some of the work for us, which is awesome. So there's kind of just this historic, and they're just cool, and they are. I mean, they're just cool. They're so weird. They have this weird life cycle where like the baby mussels, or they call them veligers, or teeny tiny little like things, microscopic, life stage. They detach themselves to fish gills, and so they're dependent on fish really to survive. And again, so now we have cool fish back in the river. So some of these mussels that need these certain fish, now we have them back. Just bizarre. Such a bizarre life cycle. So cool creatures, something we should be doing, and plus they're going to help us.
That's cool.
It is. It is really cool.
Another question I have for you. Thank you for that. The sediment, I know that's a big issue behind the gorge dam, because it's going to take
Yeah.
a year to get rid of all the sediment so
Yeah.
that they don't just wash it downstream. Were those issues that you guys had to take into consideration as well?
So the gorge dam is kind of an anomaly. First of all, it's so huge in this area. Other places not. In other places, the gorge dam really, I mean, we think is some big giant thing. Other places, it's not really that big. If you compare that to a lot of dams out west, it's like a little little kid built some little thing in a creek. you know, but so there's so much sediment back to, we didn't really have that issue with the Brecksville Dam, for instance. There was some sediment backed up behind that dam, but it just wasn't so tall, and there's still a lot of like turbidity, I mean not turbidity, yeah, turbidity, like water movement and stuff. So we didn't have that problem. Most of the other dams, like the Monroe Falls dams, even the Cuyahoga Falls dams, they didn't really have that huge issue with contamination because they just weren't so big, and they didn't have the same stuff coming. The Gorge Dam was catching a lot of bad stuff, for better or worse. And so yeah, so we took ours out. We didn't really have to worry that much about that, but that's a huge, giant undertaking just to get that sediment out of there.
Mhm.
Does that answer your question?
It sure does. And then I have
Okay.
one last question,
Sure.
and then
Sure.
I'll stop and I'll let the rest of you talk. Um, did you have to stock any fish, or did they just naturally come back in most cases?
So we did not stock any fish. All those fish came back. The two fish species that are being stocked by the Ohio Department of Natural Resources in the Cuyahoga River, they just started stocking steelhead, which is a non-native fish. And, there were never steelhead or rainbow trout in this area, actually. So they're stocking that for a recreational fishery to try and get that stronger in the Cuyahoga River. And then something they just started, and this is like a big partnership project with a bunch of agencies, is stocking lake sturgeon. And that to me is one of the coolest projects that we could be doing. Lake sturgeon, I don't know if any people on this call know about sturgeon. They're an ancient type of fish. They've been around literally for millions and millions of years. Lake sturgeon can grow up to 6 feet or bigger. They can weigh up 100, 200 pounds. And to have something like that back in the Cuyahoga River, that's when we really know that things are changing and that some of that wildness is back. So we just released totally tiny amount, like it was 60 baby sturgeons, they were like this big, you can hold them in your hand. It takes them, decades, 10 or 20 years easy before they'll come back from Lake Erie into the river to reproduce. But going forward in the next few years, like I think it's 10 years maybe, they're committed to stocking over 1,000. So, this was a small introduction just to get something going. But going forward, we'll be putting a lot in. And then we'll be following them because they have those little tags in them. And whenever they swim by, like most of us, like I wouldn't even know it, there are buoys and stuff all around Lake Erie. They're in the river, they're in the ports, tracking these fish swimming by. And so we'll be able to tell immediately, like, where are those little babies? Are they making out to Lake Erie? Where are they? And then next year when we put in a lot, all of a sudden it'll be like, boom, So yeah, super, super cool project, I think.
That's cool. That's awesome.
That is
Yeah.
cool.
Thank you.
I had heard about the sturgeon, and we were all nerding out at work
Yeah.
about it.
It's
The
just
other
crazy.
thing, one more thing
Excuse me.
about fish. I know Cuyahoga Parks is doing the brook trout reintroduction at a few of their parks, so that's been exciting too.
Yes.
My question was going to be about plants. So, you were talking about the eradicating the Japanese knotweed that's, all over. I assume, does the park have, I don't know, this, working departments of the national park. Do we have like a crew that's designated for the invasive plant removal?
So we have some regional crews that kind of travel around, and that's what they do. They're called invasive plant management crews, basically, or teams. But so we have them, and they come here to this park. They go to all the parks. I've worked at different parks. They always have these traveling crews. Here we have like just a crew that I've been able to fund on my own. So the National Park Service isn't funding it. I'm getting funding from outside sources, sometimes government, sometimes not government, sometimes other nonprofits. National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, for instance, they do a lot of super cool grants, particularly, like for pollinators and stuff. Any organization can apply for these grants. You guys can
Yeah.
apply for them,
Yeah.
So I have my own crew that I'm like self-funded here. That ranges, it depends on the funding year, but from 2 to 6, people, and they
Yeah.
are, that's their job, to kill invasives and then plant native stuff.
Okay, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Do you
I'm,
do like volunteer invasive pole
we
events?
do. And so thank you. Yeah, that's what I was just going to mention too. So yes, I'm just going to plug it, is we do, like, we have a crew of regular, they're like people who work with me every week. I call them the regular volunteers. They're here and they're mostly retired folks. And they come out twice a week throughout, even now throughout the winter, because winters are so wacky, like they can do it. So we have a
Right.
group of 10 to 20, at least twice a week throughout the year. They're out there killing invasive plants. But then beginning in like May and June, we have a whole variety of drop-in things where they're just on the calendar. So like Thursday afternoon, some Saturdays, they're on the park calendar, excuse me, on our website. Just
Yeah.
anybody can just come here and help us kill invasive plants. We have volunteer events where people can come help us collect native seeds that we grow in our greenhouse. We have drop-in plants to like plant, events to plant trees or wildflowers. So yeah. So we just finished all that, but it'll start up again next spring and it'll go through November, basically.
Yeah. Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris.
I might even send, like, Sherry, I don't know who the contact is. I'll probably just send it to Sherry, but like a link to, like, so and you can maybe spread it if you want, just for a volunteer calendar. It's
Yeah,
gonna be
that'd be
empty now,
awesome.
but
Yes, that would be wonderful.
yeah. Yeah, we're always looking for help. No question.
I know a lot of our members like to get out and get their hands dirty, so.
Yeah, it's cool. Yeah. All
Does
right.
anybody else have any questions for Chris or comments?
I have a quick question, and maybe I got here late, so maybe this was addressed, but I was wondering if, or what are the native predators to mussels, or if there are any?
Yeah, that's a good question too, and that's one we get like kind of occasionally, but so mostly like otters would really like mussels, for instance. Muskrats will eat mussels, if they can find them. There aren't any, so they're not doing it. But like where I live on a small lake in Portage Lakes area down south of Akron. And we have, like, they're all non-native mussels, like in the lake where I live, but well, mostly. But the muskrats love them. They make these little, again, piles, I go out by my dock and, it's like, I don't know, as big as a trash can, where they've like dug up all the, these mussels and eaten them. So yeah, so once they're there, they're cool. They're a part of the chain, definitely.
Thank you.
Sure.
That was a good question.
I like your background, by the way. Those lights are like crazy. That's cool.
Thanks.
I know. Yeah, exactly.
I have a
Okay.
question. Chris, did you go to Coventry High School?
I did. Did you go there?
Okay.
Did you seriously?
Yes, I did.
I'm totally not joking. It's been like decades, but even when I saw you, and I saw your name, I'm like, is that Diane from like Coventry? I
Diane
almost
Miller,
asked you.
Coventry High School.
I know.
In
Seriously, I almost asked you, but
1982.
I was like, that's gonna be weird. And then you'll be like, what are you, So
Yeah, I
Yeah.
thought right away, I'm like, that's got to be Coventry Chris. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, it is.
We're having our own separate conversation.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Well, nice to see you again after like what, 40 years or 50 years almost now? 40, I
You don't
guess.
have to, you don't have
Yeah.
to say it specifically if you don't want to.
I know I'm dating myself too, but
Well,
it's
it's
been a
good to
while.
see you again.
Yeah, likewise. Cool.
What a small world. That's fun.
I know, it's wacky.
It's
So I'm kind
awesome.
of running over. I don't want to, I know, and you guys already like,
Oh, it's okay. It's good conversation. So I'd rather, I like having everybody chatting, and excited and asking questions. So, all right.
well, thank you.
Uh,
Thank you for the invite. And I will just say one more quick thing. So
Yeah.
Sherry or, whoever, like, if somebody has a question or whatever, feel free to like share my contact information or, whatever. So
For
I'm
sure.
happy to like
Thank you,
follow up too
Chris.
after this. Yeah. Cool organization you guys have going.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.